Howdy, y'all. Welcome to this edition of the History of Christianity Season 2. Today we are on Part 17. We're going to be talking about Protestantism at the edges, and what that means is the Protestant movement in some of the countries that we haven't really talked a lot about yet. So we'll be talking about a few of those today. Let's jump into this. To begin, it would be helpful to look at the state of Christianity in 16th century Europe. During the 16th century, Christian denominations all took for granted that a state must have a single religion to which all subjects must adhere. What that means is everybody agreed that the way things were to be done, right or wrong, but the way that it was going to be done, is that a state would make a decision about which religion they would hold to. So obviously, if that's Catholic, then it's Catholic. If it's Protestant, there's different branches of Protestantism. It might be the Lutheran group. It might be the Reformed movement. Most likely not going to be Anabaptist, but there were a few of those around. So they would definitely agree that that was the way things were to happen. So it wasn't that you got to pick what religion you wanted to be a part of, but somebody picked it for you, and that particular state would all adhere to that religion. That's the way that it was supposed to work, but it's certainly not the way that it always worked. France and its religious wars stood as an example of the consequences of the notion that a state must have only one religion. We talked about France and the fact that they were, for a long time, constantly at war as a result of this policy, because there were people living in the States, for instance, and for the most part in France, it was going to be Catholicism, and there were Protestants. They didn't want to be Catholics, and so they wanted to practice their religion that they believed was correct. And so that got to be a huge problem. It brought a lot of wars. It brought a lot of division. And people actually in France, even the Catholic people, got to the point that they said, I don't care if it's Protestant or not. I'm going to stand with them because I don't want any more war. We can't constantly be having wars. And France kind of tried to find a solution to their problem. They did in a way, but it wasn't a perfect solution. Even the Edict of Nantes, which ended those wars, only ensured the survival of Protestantism by granting it a number of cities that would remain Protestant while the rest of the nation would remain Catholic. So in France, it did work a little bit differently. It wasn't necessarily that there were states carved out that some would be Protestant, some would be Catholic, but there were particular cities. And that was granted to them at this Edict of Nantes. And so those particular cities that were by and large Protestant got to stay Protestant, but everybody else was Catholic. And that did bring an end to the war, but it didn't really permanently provide a solution to that issue in France or other places. Yet in every land, there were those who disagreed with the faith espoused by the government, and that's going to be the case. You're not going to have everybody agreeing on religion. And that's one of the things that people say you shouldn't get into conversations about if you want things to be peaceful, religion and politics. And it's true. You're not going to have everybody agree. And there are going to be people living in a particular place, especially at this time when there's a lot of options out there that maybe weren't there before. You're definitely going to have people disagree about it. So that was the case. And as is obvious from what we've looked at, there are definitely going to be those who go with flow, and the majority will. Whether they really agree with it or not, they don't want to go through what's going to happen if they don't. But there's still going to be those that are not going to go along with it. And that's what we're going to kind of see today. In both England and France, there were dire consequences for those who followed a different path than their governments. And the dire consequences were typically that they were going to be killed, and not necessarily in the nicest way. So there were definitely going to be big time consequences. At best, if you got lucky, you might just get in prison for life. But that's not going to be great. There were some that were exiled, or they fled the country. Again, you think, well, yeah, they got away with their life, but they left behind everything they'd ever known, the places that they had lived their whole lives. This was a time that people didn't necessarily do that a lot. You typically, if you were born and raised somewhere, that's typically where you probably are going to die. And if not, it was going to be fairly close. It wasn't going to be running around to other countries. People did it, but most of these people that fled these countries didn't do it willingly. They didn't want to. And it was a great sacrifice for them. So they found that there were going to be dire consequences in those places. The story of Christianity in 16th century Europe would be incomplete without acknowledging some of the struggles and contributions of those who remain firm in their convictions. So we want to look at those today. We want to talk about some in different nations that had to go through a lot in order to maintain faith in what they believed in. And it kind of harkens back to the days of the early church when you had people that were being persecuted, people that were being hounded, there were people being killed, there were people being imprisoned, losing their homes, losing their jobs, losing their family. And yet it didn't stop the spread. And it's one more example, we talk about this a lot, of how history continues to repeat itself. Did the people at this time, were they able to go back and look at ancient history? Some were. It was definitely out there. Not a lot of them probably studied it, but they still didn't equate it to what they were going through. They were looking at the early churches being their people, especially if they're Catholic, and they're not seeing that the Protestants who have left them behind and are now being persecuted by them are kind of like that early church. So they don't see the commonality there, and are therefore not able to see the fact that all of the measures they're taking to try to stop what's happening is actually just ensuring that it's going to continue. So the lessons of history are rarely learned, and that is certainly going to be the case as we look through these. We'll start by looking at Spain, which we know to be a very heavily Catholic nation. Before the outbreak of the Protestant Reformation, there were many who hoped Spain would lead in the Reformation of the Catholic Church. We talked about that when we talked about Spain. There was a push by the leadership in Spain to bring reform, but it didn't really carry through because something happened. As a result of the Protestant Reformation, things changed. At the Diet of Worms, Martin Luther dared to challenge Emperor Charles V of Spain. Remember, this is the emperor that was the king of Spain. He became the emperor, and he was challenged directly by Martin Luther. So Spain's definitely not going to go along with that. This is their guy. And so anything that has to do with reform from that point on is going to be looked at badly. After this happened, the Spanish Inquisition, previously directed mostly at Jews, turned its attention to those calling for reformation. And it didn't matter if you were calling for reformation as a part of Luther's group or the Protestant Reformation, or even if you were calling for reformation within the Catholic Church and had no intention of ever leaving the Catholic Church, you were still going to be painted in a bad light, because for them, once that happened, anything that had to do with reform was associated with Luther, and anything that had to do with Luther was associated as a direct challenge to the emperor who came from Spain. So it really turned things around as far as what had begun in Spain as a Reformation movement and might possibly have been the leader of reform in the Catholic Church. That all of a sudden went away. Even those calling only for Reformation within the Catholic Church became targets. So those humanists that were there, that were part of the group Erasmus had influence over, they didn't want to leave the Catholic Church. They weren't calling for let's split off. In fact, many of them would not go along with Luther. They wouldn't go along with the Protestant Reformation once it became completely separated from the Catholic Church, because they didn't want to leave the Catholic Church. But it didn't matter. Just the fact that they were associated with the word reform, with the ideas of Reformation in the minds of many in Spain, that put them with Luther. And so they had to leave. Many of them were hounded, and this Inquisition came through Spain and began to target them. And so they either went through that, many of them lost their lives, or they got out of there. So a lot of them, they fled the country. So that took away a segment of the population that really wanted reform in the Catholic Church. They weren't around anymore. They left. And anybody that would remain realized if you push for that, you're going to end up just like they did. So that really changed things in Spain quite a bit. Yet the Inquisition was not able to put a stop to the move of Protestantism into Spain. A Geronimite monastery in Santa Ponce became a center of Reformation to which Bibles and Protestant books were smuggled. As stated earlier, you can push against it, you can try to kill people, you can imprison, you can shed blood, you can discourage. When it comes to Christianity, and it may be this way with all world religions, I really don't know, but definitely in the history of Christianity, as soon as you start the persecution, that ramps up the efforts. And if you want to surely have no question being asked about Protestantism surviving, then just go ahead and try to stop it. As soon as that happened, it was destined to continue to flourish. And it's just the human nature, I guess. But as soon as it became illegal, then the books are being smuggled in, the Bibles that people could read in their own language were being smuggled in, and the movement's going to continue for sure. When the smuggler was captured and burned, 12 of the monks in the monastery fled with plans to meet a year later in Geneva, and they did. We could take some time to talk about these monks, but we really don't have time to do that today. There's a possibility we might get back to it later on, but they were influential. They did accomplish some things that are important. But the idea here is that the guy that was smuggling in the books, they caught him, and they didn't give him a slap on the wrist. They didn't tell him, hey, don't do that again. They didn't tell him, you're going to jail. They just burned him. And it's just kind of the way things went back in those days. It's hard for us and with modern eyes to see this and really comprehend it. It just seems unnecessary that you would do something like that, but they didn't think about it that way. And, we can try to go back and whitewash history and change what happened, but it's not going to help anything to do that, because it did happen that way. You can pull down statues, you can rewrite history books, you can do whatever you want to do. It doesn't change the fact that that's the way it happened, and it also doesn't change the fact that these things repeatedly happen. Now, there may not be people being burned in the Western world. There may not be horrific killings, but there's definitely movements to challenge thinking that's not of the convention or of the leadership or of the vast majority of people, or whatever you want to say. If you don't believe that, just get on Twitter. Just get on social media, get on any of that stuff, and you'll find people are being canceled, people are being ostracized, people are being attacked and harassed because of their opinions. And it's the modern equivalent of burning them at the stake in a lot of ways. People will go after somebody's job, they'll go after their family, they'll do anything they can to try to hurt that person if they don't agree with something that they say or think. It doesn't mean that everything that they say or think is correct. And in a lot of cases, it's bad. It might be something that we would all agree is bad, but it's still not the way to go about doing things, to try to wipe a person out in whatever way that might be, whether it's literally their life or if it's the way that they live their life can't be what they would like it to be. They can't have a job. They can't do this. They can't do that. They can't go out without being harassed. Either way you look at it, these things just cycle on through. And again, we think we've come so far, but honestly, we really haven't. Those that remain suffered the wrath of the Inquisition. Studies in the 20th century seem to indicate that the Inquisition was not completely successful in totally eliminating the movement from Spain. Now, we say that when the persecution comes, then things flourish. In Spain, it was really tough, because that Spanish Inquisition, they wiped a lot of people out. And when you make the decision you're just going to kill everybody, then you can limit a movement quite a bit. But it didn't wipe it out completely. There were still Protestants around. They were in small in number, and they had to be very careful, and it was hard for them, but they did survive. So even as this is going to be the most extreme example of going after Protestants, and that's in Spain now. But even there, they weren't completely successful in eliminating it. Just can't be done. The next country we're going to look at is Italy, and we're going to go back to a group that we actually talked about last season. You may remember, we didn't talk a lot about them, but we talked a little bit, and we'll have to do a little bit of going back and refamiliarizing ourselves with this group, but we'll do that in just a moment. In the inaccessible valleys among the Alps, the ancient community begun by Peter Waldo continued to exist. So this is a group that was started by Peter Waldo. I want to go back to our study last season, and I want to read for you from the book. This is the History of Christianity, Volume 1, and this is about the group that was started by Peter Waldo. And so I'm going to read from you actually straight from the book so that you can be familiar again, because we're going to talk quite a bit about these guys today. So I'm quoting from the book now, quote, "A forerunner of the mendicant orders was Peter Waldo, a merchant from Lyons, who heard the story of a monk who practiced extreme poverty and was moved by it to devote himself to a life of poverty and preaching. He soon gathered a number of followers, but the archbishop forbade their activities. They appealed to Rome, and the theologians appointed to hear their case treated them with derision for their ignorance. In spite of this, and despite repeated condemnations, they continued preaching. Persecution then forced them to withdraw to remote valleys in the Alps, where they continued existing until the Protestant Reformation. At that time, they were approached by Reformed theologians whose teachings they accepted and thus became Protestant. So we're going to actually look at that process now, but this is that group that was one of the very few examples. You know, we talked about how through the history of the church, when the Catholic Church got control of the universal church and they started to really get power behind them from the state, they were able to pretty much wipe out anybody that was what they considered to be a heretic, anybody that had a dissenting opinion. They could get rid of them in whatever way they chose. And that person did have something to say about that. They might have to kill them. They might be able to persuade them to recant. They might put them in prison, depending on who it was. But they could largely wipe these movements out. But there were a few exceptions, and this was one of those exceptions. This group that was started by Peter Waldo, they were very interested in living a life of extreme poverty, and they did have teachings that differed from the church for sure, and they were rejected as a result of that. But the way they were able to survive is they moved into these valleys in the Alps, and it was very difficult for anybody to get to them. So they were kind of there, just hanging out, living their lives, still existing. Everything wasn't going great. In fact, the movement had kind of started to wane and back down, but things changed. But by the 16th century, repeated attacks and persecution led to increasing numbers returning to Catholicism. So they were kind of being worn down finally. And yet that didn't end up being what happened, because the Reformation happened. Then rumors of the Reformation taking place in other lands began to arrive. An emissary was sent to inquire about the rumors. In 1526, he returned with the news that they were true, that in Germany, Switzerland, France, and even more distant regions, a Reformation was afoot. So here's this little group. They're kind of the forgotten group. They haven't been forgotten by the church, but nobody's able to really stop them completely. So it's at an impasse, and yet they're constantly being persecuted. They're constantly being attacked. They can't really rest easy and just practice their faith. And they're starting to get to the point where people are saying, you know what, enough's enough. We're tired of this. It's not worth it. We're just going to go be Catholics. And then all of a sudden, they start hearing about another descending group, another group that has broken away from the Catholic Church. And they're getting very interested about that. So they sent their emissary out, go find out what's going on. And this person does, and they returned and said, you know what, it's true. In fact, it's even more than what we thought. This is breaking out everywhere. It's all over Germany. It's in Switzerland. It's even in some places in France, and even more places out there. And this is going on. So now all of a sudden they're thinking, okay, we're not the only ones anymore. And that kind of changes their attitude about it. Even more exciting for the community was the news that many of the doctrines of the reformers agreed with what the Waldensians had held for centuries. So some of these Reformation ideas that were thought of being novel and kind of going back to the early parts of Christianity, but nobody had really held them for a long time, that actually wasn't correct. The Waldensians actually did hold a lot of these doctrines, but nobody knew who they were. They didn't know where they were. They didn't study them. They were just isolated. They were this little group that was trying to be hunted down. But there were a lot of points of doctrine they agreed on. So they're thinking, okay, here's a group that we can get along with. And they're making a move. They're moving on up. So maybe there's hope for us after all. In 1532, the Waldensians gathered in a synod, and after some discussion adopted what amounted to the main tenets of the Protestant Reformation, making them the oldest Protestant church existing more than 3 centuries before the Reformation began. Wow, 300 years before this awesome Reformation, this break that occurred. There was actually a group out there that agreed with many of the same things that were going to come out in the Reformation time, but they were just so ahead of their time that they couldn't really make the impact that Luther did. But they still existed, and now they're seeing we can join in with the Protestant movement. We can be Protestants ourselves. There's so much commonality. We don't have to feel like, well, that's not us. We can be right in with them. And they did. So they joined up with the Protestant Reformation. Now they're part of it as well. And that's a great step forward. But did it really help them? Well, it didn't necessarily. This did not make things easier for the Waldensians. Their followers in southern France were invaded and practically exterminated. Many of the survivors fled for refuge in the Alps. So in southern France, there wasn't this territory, this Alps area, valley area that could protect them in a natural geographic way. So they were kind of out in the open, and they were not well received in France. And especially when they started getting associated with the Protestant movement, that was a bad thing in France at that time. So they ran them out of there. They just about got rid of them. The ones that survived got out, and they're heading down to the Alps. They're heading down to where they can be protected. Likewise, the Waldensian communities that had developed earlier in Calabria in southern Italy were exterminated. So again, a group that wasn't in that natural protected area in the Valley of the Alps, they got hunted down. So they found a group they could associate with, but unfortunately, in the places that they lived, those Protestant groups were not very well received. And yeah, they had done great in Germany. They had done really well in Switzerland. They had had some victory in France. Eventually, they would at least have some cities that they could control. But it's not going to help them really in the places that they're at. It's certainly not going to help them in Italy. And it's not going to help them in France in the areas where the Waldensians were. So it helped them to be able to associate with this larger movement, but it didn't really help them where they were. And they actually got ran out of France and even out of southern Italy. But the Waldensians in the Alps remained steadfast in their faith, defeating several attempts at invasion by large armies supported by the Pope, by the Duke of Savoy, and by other powerful lords. So they hung tough. Man, they were in a great natural geographic area. It was hard to get down in there where they were. It was tough, and they could defend it with a smaller group of people than they ordinarily would have been able to defend it with. So if you were going to go after those Waldensians, you'd better be ready, because you were going to be taking some losses. You're going to be taking some hits, and it better be worth it to you, because it's going to take a lot to get them out, and nobody had ever been able to do it. And they stood steadfast in that area. When peace was finally attained for an extended period, plague broke out, decimating the population, and actually only 2 pastors in that whole region survived. So this is a really bad plague. They had kind of gotten to a point where everybody was willing to say, all right, just go on and you've been there for 300 years. We're just going to leave you alone. Just do your thing. You're stuck. I mean, in one way, it's helping you, but it also hurts you in the fact that you can't really get out and interact with anybody else. So we don't have to worry about you spreading out throughout Italy or France or anywhere else for that matter. You're going to have to stay where you're at. So we'll just leave you alone. And just as that happened, well, here comes the plague. And that really hurt them. It decimated things. And only 2 pastors survived, but it did bring one benefit. The replacements came from the Reformed areas of Switzerland. This helped develop closer ties between the Waldensians and the Reformed. So the Waldensians became very associated with the Reformed movement, because when they had this plague and all their pastors got wiped out, they had to bring in some people to be the pastors, and they came from the Reformed areas of Switzerland, and obviously they took Reformed theology with them. So the Waldensians and the Reformed grew closer and had close ties together, so that was a good thing. In 1655, all Waldensians living in what is now northern Italy were commanded to quit their lands within 3 days and sell them to good Catholics. And then they were supposed to move to not such a good area. Well, you think about that. What does that mean? It means the land that they were holding was looked at as being very valuable, but it also meant that if you can dig them out of there and make them move somewhere else, maybe more out in the open, then you can knock them out for sure. So there was a twofold thing there. It wasn't just that they wanted to give their valuable lands, although that was part of it, but they wanted to get them dug out. Let's get them out. We get them out in the open, then we can deal with them. So that was not going to go over well with Waldensians, as you can imagine. That same year, the Marquis of Pianeza marched against the Waldensians. Fearful that his army would suffer a similar fate as those who had invaded before, he offered peace to the Waldensians. I want y'all to listen to this guy. Man, I'm telling you right now, if there's somebody that is a dirt bag, it's this dude. You're going to find out in a few minutes when we read through this. If there's scum of the earth, this guy's lower than scum of the earth. He goes in and wants to have a fair fight and decides, oh, I'm too scared. I don't want to go in and fight these guys because they've been able to wipe out armies even better than mine before. So we're going to just offer peace. But they figured something out. Since the Waldensians insisted that they would make war only to defend themselves, they took in Pianiza's soldiers, admitting them into their own homes, providing them food and shelter from the cold. So they say, okay, you want to be peaceful? Then we're going to treat you in a peaceful way. We don't want war. We just want to be left alone. So if you come with the idea that you're going to invade, but then you decide to offer peace, then we will take you in. We'll take care of you. And they did that. And what this lowlife did is just disgusting. Listen to this. But 2 days later, in a cowardly act of treachery at a prearranged signal, the supposedly peaceful guests turned on their hosts and killed men, women, and children. This act was celebrated with a Te Deum. I don't see how in the world anyone can actually think that these people had a relationship with Jesus Christ. I don't like to sit here and question somebody's faith. I really don't. I know a person's heart is not obvious to everybody. There are people that you think their heart is great and it's not. And there are people that you don't think that they could ever be right with the Lord, and maybe they get to be, or maybe they even are, and they have some rough edges. But man, you go in with something like this. This is as low as it can get. I just can't imagine how you could be any lower. They get in, and remember, this was not the original plan. They came in to fight, and they decided they were too scared to fight. But once they figured out that they were going to be taken in by these people and taken care of, then this sorry Marquis, he got them together and he said, all right, we're going to do this. We're going to get in there. And when I give you the signal, then after they've taken you in for a couple of days and they trust you and letting you kind of have the run of the place, then you go in and wipe out the whole families, man. And then to go after that and have a song of celebration to God, as if God would ever have gone along with this sorry plan. I mean, it's as bad as it gets. We've talked about some real dirt bags in this study, especially since this Protestant Reformation has broken out and the way people are treating each other. But we'll keep going through this. We'll probably find some even sorrier people, unfortunately. But this is bad. This one's really bad. And again, I don't think for 1 second I'm going to be running any of these people on the streets of gold. I really doubt it. I just can't see how a person's heart could be changed by God and do something like this. But anyway, that's what they did. So they won and they sang a little tune, but man, that's bad. Still, the Waldensians resisted. It would not be until the Revolution of 1848 that the Waldensians and other dissident groups were finally granted freedom of worship. So into the almost midway through the 1800s, that they got their freedom to worship. But they didn't give up, even with this, even with just a cowardly attack on them. They weren't going to give up. They were hanging in there, and they did. They hung in through all of this. But hardship would continue. Well, that's kind of the story of this group. In 1850, famine broke out. Soon the first of many Waldensian contingents left for Uruguay, so they finally left. It took a lot, and it took a famine in the area. That's where you can't stay anymore. If you can't get food, you can't stay. So they got out, and they finally got them out of there. At that point, they were leaving them alone, but they finally got out. There and later in Argentina, they settled and flourished, taking leadership in promoting agricultural innovation. So this group did really well. After they received their religious freedom, they could be left alone. They got out. They went to other countries, and they actually became leaders in those communities, particularly when it comes to agriculture. So it was kind of a good ending for this group that they did that, but they went through a lot of hard stuff in the meantime. Other Protestant groups existed in Italy as well. It wasn't just the Waldensians. So we're going to talk about very briefly about some of these. Juan de Valdez was a Spanish Erasmian of Protestant inclinations who was forced to leave Spain and seek refuge in Italy in 1531. So old Juan, he's kicked out of Spain. Remember, he's with the humanist group, but he kind of does go along with Protestants, and some of the humanists did. And they told him, you know what, Spain's probably not the place for you, bud. And they sent him packing. But he came on in for whatever reason. I don't know why he thought Italy was the place to go for refuge. Most of the people left and went to Switzerland or something like that. But for whatever reason, he thought Italy would be the place to go. So he entered Italy in 1531. Valdez settled in Naples and gathered around himself a group of followers and colleagues who devoted themselves to Bible study, but were fairly moderate in their Protestant leanings. So he gets a little group of followers. A member of this group, Bernardino Ochino, openly embraced and taught Protestant principles. When threatened by the Inquisition, he fled to Geneva. So he went to the place where most people left or went to flee. From that point on, his life was a series of wanderings, both geographical and doctrinal. Doctrinally, he became increasingly radical. Eventually, he rejected the doctrine of the Trinity and defended polygamy. Now, we're going to see here in a moment, there's a couple of groups at this time that are going against the Trinity. I don't know why leaving the Catholic Church and going into Protestant teaching made them go out against the Trinity, but he's not the only one. There's a couple. Now, wasn't very many defending polygamy, but for whatever reason, he did that too. For this reason, he had to leave Zurich and continue wandering until he died of the plague in 1564. So that was brief, but that's just a little bit of the history of some of the other groups that were Protestant in Italy as well. So now we turn our attention to Hungary. At the beginning of the Protestant Reformation, Hungary was ruled by 10-year-old King Louis II. So obviously not a real strong king there if you got a 10-year-old in charge. After the Ottoman Turks defeated the Hungarians and killed the king, the Hungarian nobility elected Ferdinand of Habsburg to occupy the throne. So King Louis II is out. He's gone because he's dead. And the nobles got together and decided, well, we'll get old Ferdinand in charge. We like him. That didn't go over with everybody. So others of strong nationalist sentiments named John Sigismund as their king. So you got rival kings. After complex negotiations, Hungary was partly under Habsburg, but mostly under Ottoman rule. So Sigismund didn't have a whole lot of area to rule. He does have one place we'll look at, but mostly the Ottoman Turks. So even the Habsburgs didn't have a lot. The western edge of Hungary, ruled by the Habsburgs, supported Catholicism. So you have just that western little edge there is the Habsburgs' rule, but they had more than Sigismund. Transylvania enjoyed a measure of autonomy. Eventually, King Sigismund decided that religious division was weakening the nation and declared that 4 forms of Christianity would have equal standing: Roman Catholicism, Lutheranism, the Reformed tradition, and Unitarianism. We'll get into the Unitarian stuff in just a little bit, but this king here, he's the king in Transylvania. It's so strange to me, looking back over this history, to talk about Transylvania. The only thing I know about Transylvania is that's where Dracula came from. So I can't think about Transylvania without thinking about Bela Lugosi, but that's not anything that's real. That's made up. But King Sigismund is real, and he came along and decided, he had enough of all these divisions, and he just said, you can have any one of these. Here's 4 choices: Roman Catholicism, Lutheranism, Reformed tradition, and Unitarianism. So he was kind of ahead of his time in that way, because he did allow his subjects to pick a religion. That was not common at all and was very much discouraged, but he went with it. But it's just a small place. But most of Hungary was ruled by the Ottomans. So the biggest part of Hungary is not even under Christian rule at all. Their policy was to promote division among Christians, initially putting Catholicism at a disadvantage. And the reason for that is Catholicism was the strongest. And so they wanted to weaken it, and they saw putting some support to Protestantism would help to weaken Catholicism. So it's not that they were fans of Protestant. In fact, later on, when the Protestants gained the upper hand, they started doing the same tactics, but they did it to the Protestants then. So they just want to try to weaken Christianity any way they can. So Catholicism then had to go through a lot of problems caused by the Ottomans. In fact, the pressure on Catholicism was such that between 1500 to 1606, the number of Franciscans in the land was reduced from 1500 to 30. 1500 to 30, that is huge. Now, it's over 100 years, but still, 1500 were there and it got down to 30. That's almost gone. So really, really crazy to see how much Catholicism suffered under the Ottomans. Lutheranism reached Hungary at an early date and had to exist under these conditions. By 1523, the Hungarian Diet under Habsburg rule ordered that Lutherans be burned to prevent the spread of their teaching. So once again, here come the Protestants, and they're not welcomed in Catholic territory. So that little part that Habsburgs ruled at that time, if you were Lutheran, you were going to be burned. It was not good. And they went against the Protestants, but guess what that did? It just helped them to spread even more. A few years later, Zwingli's teachings entered the country. Similar measures were taken against them, but in the territory ruled by the Ottomans, Protestantism grew more rapidly. Again, because it's kind of that idea, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so they want to weaken Catholicism, then let's support Protestantism. And so as a result, Protestants gained an advantage there. It wasn't because the Ottomans liked them, but they still got to enjoy that. The Hungarians preferred the Reformed tradition to the Lutheran because the latter seemed too hierarchical. So they didn't really like that form of government. They wanted to get away from it. And so they weren't going to like that way of being ruled in the churches. So it wasn't necessarily a doctrinal issue. It was more about the way the church was governed that put them more in the Reformed tradition. So the Reformed tradition is going to grow in the Protestant areas of Hungary more than the Lutheran tradition. Both the Habsburgs and the Ottomans took measures to prevent the spread of unwanted teaching by means of the printing press. That sentence can be a little bit confusing. They didn't use the printing press to put a stop to unwanted teachings. They put a stop to the printing press being used to promote unwanted teaching. So I'll tell you how that happened with the Ottomans. In 1483, the Sultan had issued a decree condemning printers to having their hands cut off. So that's kind of a bad deal. If you're a printer or a human being in this world, you probably don't want your hands cut off. And so he said, you can print all you want to, but if you print anything that we don't like, we're going to cut your hands off. So that was as early as 1483. Ferdinand I issued a similar ruling against any unapproved printing. So you think, oh man, that's bad. Old Ferdinand, he's barbaric. He's taken to these tactics. He's going to cut off the hands. Well, no, he didn't do that. Instead of cutting your hands off, he said that they would just be drowned. So you had one, if you're under Ottoman rule and you printed something you weren't supposed to, you lived, but you didn't have any hands. If you're with old Ferdinand, you just drowned. They killed you. They drowned you. I don't know which was worse. I guess it's better to live with no hands, but really that's not a good choice either way. So they would try to keep from stuff being printed and sent out because they knew that was the way Protestantism was spreading. Definitely through preachers and teachers, but also through printing material and sending it out to the people in the language they could read it in, and also translating Bibles into the language they could read. That was a big spread, and they thought, well, we'll put a stop to that. We'll just stop the printing from happening. Well, do you think it stopped it? It didn't. It didn't anywhere. Still, Protestant books circulated, some being printed in secret and others smuggled into the country. So the same way we heard about earlier, the smuggling in of books, the printing of books and distribution, it still went on, and it happened in secret, and it still got out to the people regardless of these rules that they had. One result of this was that the publications were largely written in the vernacular. It was written for common people to be able to read and understand. This culminated in the publication of the Koroi Bible in 1590 and the Vizioi Bible in 1607. I know I probably didn't pronounce those right. In fact, I'm sure I didn't, but sorry. I looked them up. It's just harder to pronounce those words for me. And those of you that know these languages, then you can correct that. But regardless, the Bibles that were printed played a big role in leading people to Protestantism because they were written in a language that people could read and understand. And so it helped them to understand the points that the Protestants were trying to make that were scriptural in nature. To be able to actually read what they were talking about in the scripture themselves helps. And so that's what they did, and it made a big impact to be able to do that. By 1600, as many as 4 out of 5 Hungarians were Protestants. That's big. I mean, that's the vast majority of the country. And did it stay that way, though? Well, it didn't. Then everything changed. By the 17th century, Ottoman power was coming to an end, and Transylvania clashed with the Habsburgs. So if the Ottomans are coming out, then are leaving their powerful position, then that leaves most of Hungary wide open. So who does that give the upper hand to? Well, the Habsburgs don't have a whole lot, but they got a whole lot more than Transylvania. So they were able to get things the other way, but not right away. At first, Transylvania gained the upper hand, and the conflict ended with the Treaty of Vienna, which granted equal rights to both Catholics and Protestants. That's a great thing. In our modern way of looking at things, we think that's the way it should be. And it is the way it should be. It should be that people can practice the religion that they feel is correct. But in their time, that's people aren't looking at it as being a good thing. The Protestants were, but the Catholics certainly were not, and that is a compromise they don't want to keep. So they're not going to stick with that forever. But then the 30 Years' War brought even more division within the country. In the end, the Habsburgs gained the upper hand, and the Peace of Karlowitz in 1699 gave them control of almost all of Hungary. So the Habsburgs won this fight. They gained control of Hungary for the most part, and then the 4 out of 5 were Protestants went away. It became largely Catholic from then on out. Once they were in control, the Habsburgs employed strong anti-Protestant measures, and eventually the country became predominantly Catholic. Even so, the Reformed Church of Hungary and the Socinian Unitarians had a strong continued presence in Hungary. Again, we're going to get to those Unitarians in the next part when we're talking about Poland. So just hang on for that. But the Catholics take the dominant role, but they can't get rid of once again, they can't completely eliminate the Protestants. The Reformed Church hangs in there strongly, and so does the Unitarian Church. We'll finish out today with talking about Poland. At the time when Luther posted his 95 Theses, there were already in Western Poland a large number of Hussites. We talked about him as well. You'll have to go back to season 1. I'm already way over time, so don't have time to get into that again. But here's a group already that was a breakaway group, and they were there in Poland. When Luther's writings and teachings came into Poland, they did not take hold immediately due to the distrust the Polish people had for anything from Germany. That was a good instinct. They should have stuck with that later on in history. Of course, I know they did, but things with Germany and Poland don't end up being great. In fact, they end up being one of the worst situations in human history. So they were right on. They were right on in not trusting in Germany. And unfortunately, it didn't help them later. But they had the right instincts there. While Lutheranism did spread, its growth was slow. So they weren't going to go along with Luther much because he was German. When Calvinism came into the country, however, Protestantism began to make headway. So the Calvinist group was able to come in. They're not German. They're not Luther. They're not from Germany. And that some of the things that people wanted to hear, they didn't just necessarily immediately dismiss it because it was from Germany. So things have kind of taken a turn now with Calvinism coming in. By the middle of the 16th century, Calvinism enjoyed a measure of support from King Sigismund II, who even corresponded with Calvin. So you have a big deal there when the king is going along with what Calvin has to say. So that's a big change from things the way they were. The leader of the Calvinist movement in Poland was Jan Lawski. He was a nobleman who maintained correspondence with a wide circle of people of reforming inclinations. So all of the kind of the big dog leaders in the reform movement at the time, he was in contact with them. Though briefly exiled from Poland, he was called back by some among the nobility who favored Calvinism. He also translated the Bible into Polish. So he was a big early leader of the Protestant movement in Poland. In general, the Polish government followed a policy of religious tolerance, especially in comparison to most of Europe. So Poland was one of the places that you could go and you kind of had a chance, at least at that time, of being able to practice the religion of your choice. You could pick Catholicism or one of the brands of Protestantism, and you didn't get a lot of pushback from the government. So they were unique in that. As a result, a large number of people, mostly Jews and Protestant Christians, and even some groups that wouldn't have necessarily been considered Protestant but were not Catholic, they sought refuge there. You see kind of how things are setting up in world history. There's a bigger picture going on too. Jews are being persecuted throughout Europe, especially in Spain and other places. The Spanish Inquisition's after them. And all of a sudden, they find a place in Poland that they can go to and they can have some peace and to practice their religion. So you end up with a large population of Jewish people there in Poland. Well, that sets up what happens in World War II. We know Hitler comes in and he sends the Polish people to the concentration camps. And the Polish people that are going there are largely Jewish people. So you kind of see all the things that set up in history. It builds on top of one another. It's spiraling forward in time. Yes, it's circular in the fact that we keep on seeing the same patterns, but it's also moving forward too. And you see how things build upon each other to get to the place in history that they get to. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. So here's an event early on that actually is a persecution of Jewish people that brings a large segment of them into Poland, an area that's going to be eventually conquered, taken over by Germany, Nazi Germany, and it's going to result in the deaths of a lot of the generations to come from these Polish people that moved there at this time and then on through. So just another example of how history builds on itself. One of those was Faustus Socinus, whose uncle Lalius Socinus was driven out by Protestant Reformation leaders for his anti-Trinitarian doctrines. So another group that has this anti-Trinity idea. Don't know why at that time that was coming out, but some of these people that were leaving the Catholic Church and maybe initially dipped into Protestantism, they were getting thrown out of Protestantism because they were going against the Trinity, and this is another example of it. Faustus embraced his uncle's views, denying the divinity of Jesus, and sought refuge first in Transylvania, where they were giving you a choice of 4 different ways of practicing your faith, but none of them were anti-Trinity, so eventually they couldn't find a group there. So got kicked out and moved to Poland in 1579. There he joined others who agreed with his convictions, denying the doctrine of the Trinity. This group became known as Unitarians, and we still, obviously, there are Unitarians all over the world to this day, and that's how this group was started, was from a guy that denied the Trinity. His views were expressed in the Rakovian Catechism published in 1605. In it, he affirms his belief that only the Father is God, Jesus is not divine but human only, and that the Holy Spirit is just a way of referring to God's power and presence. So, again, the same unorthodox positions, the same problems, they just get recycled. This is nothing new. These were fights that were fought early in church history. They keep coming around. They come around in our day too, not just from this group, but Jehovah's Witnesses deny the divinity of Jesus, for instance. The same stuff. They say that the Holy Spirit is an it, it's not a he. There's only God the Father. So the same ideas, they just get recycled. Our enemy uses the same tricks. It's not a new playbook. It's the same stuff over and over again. And there's a reason why he does it, because it works. People fall for the same lies, the same untrue positions, and it happens over and over. And once again, it's happening here in this instance. Throughout most of the 16th century and well into the 17th, the Protestant faith and Unitarianism had a growing number of followers. So in Poland, you see the Protestant movement and even the Unitarian group, they're getting a lot of ground there, but that doesn't remain the case. But largely due to the repeated attempts of Russia and Germany to occupy Poland, and at that time they were associated with Protestant churches, not so later, but at that time they were, the country eventually turned back to Roman Catholicism. So if your attackers are Protestants, largely, then you're probably not going to feel real great about Protestants. And they didn't. So by the 20th century, Poland was one of the most Catholic nations in Europe. So a big turn back out of the Protestant movement, back into Catholicism in Poland, and it still translates there to this day. So that's all we're going to have time for today. Thanks for taking time with me today. Next week, we're going to look at this was a long one. We're going to look at a shorter one. And it's going to be a transition period. This book that we're using as our text to go through this study, it's written in chapters, but it's also written in sections. So the next session we have next week is going to be the last chapter in the first section. So it's a smaller chapter. It's a transition one. And then 2 weeks from now, we'll start into the next section of the book. So we'll talk more about that then. But get ready for that next week, a little bit shorter one. And hope you have a great week. Hope you can be back again next week. In the meantime, God bless.